Imagine the mysterious period in the life of Jesus, 18 years, from the age of 12 to 30, completely missing from the Bible. This is not just a trivial gap in history. It is one of the most baffling enigmas surrounding the life of Jesus, a mystery that has perplexed scholars, believers, and historians for centuries. Why did the Bible remain silent about such a long and crucial period? What events were so significant that they were kept hidden from the pages of the Holy Scriptures? The absence of any record raises deep questions about what truly happened during those hidden years of Jesus' life. Could this silence be intentional? Is there a greater purpose behind the Bible's lack of explanation? The truth behind those lost years could potentially reshape our understanding of Jesus' journey, his teachings, and the global impact he had on humanity. Every detail we know about Jesus today primarily comes from 4 books of the New Testament: Matthew, Luke, and John. These texts recount major events such as Jesus' birth, his ministry in Palestine, his trial, death, and resurrection, all of which took place during the last 3 years of his life. But what about the time between his birth and the beginning of his ministry? These texts reveal very little, leaving us with a vast and mysterious void. This gap has fueled countless theories, speculations, and even wild claims throughout history for what could be so profound that it was left undocumented. One story from the Gospel of Matthew tells how Jesus' family fled to Egypt shortly after his birth to escape the massacre ordered by King Herod. They only returned to Nazareth after Herod's death, but what happened during that time remains untold. However, the Coptic Christians of Egypt have preserved the memory of the Holy Family's journey through Egypt, building churches at the places where they passed. This Coptic tradition provides more insight into the events of Jesus' life during that period, adding a layer of depth to what was otherwise hidden. The Gospel of Luke recounts an episode when Jesus was 12 years old. After celebrating Passover in Jerusalem, Jesus stayed behind in the city without his parents knowing, as they had already begun their journey back. When they realized he was missing, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found Jesus in the temple, discussing and questioning the religious teachers, who were astonished by his wisdom and understanding. When his parents saw him, they were amazed, and his mother asked why he had stayed behind, as they had been anxiously searching for him. Jesus replied that he needed to be involved in his heavenly Father's business. The story shows a confident and mature young man, already displaying remarkable wisdom for his age. Yet it's curious that the only mention of the next 18 years of his life is a brief phrase in the Gospel of Luke, stating that Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, and favor with God and man. It's fascinating to think that this brilliant young boy, capable of holding the attention of learned men in the temple for 3 days, has no other significant record of his actions or words during this long period. Could there be other records of this period in Jesus' life that aren't included in the Bible? After all, the sacred traditions of the Coptic Christian Church detail the Holy Family's journey through Egypt. Are there other sources beyond the Bible that reveal what happened during the undocumented years of Jesus? In 1887, a Russian explorer and writer named Nicholas Notovitch made a discovery that seemed to shed new light on those hidden years. While traveling through the Himalayas, he visited several monasteries where he heard about a great prophet named Isa, who supposedly came from Palestine to India. A Buddhist monk described Isa as someone superior to any of the Dalai Lamas, emphasizing his spiritual significance. The monk explained that Isa had traveled from Palestine to live and preach in India for many years before returning to his homeland, where he was tortured and killed. Despite this, his teachings were adopted and spread worldwide by the descendants of those who killed him. This information struck Notovitch deeply, as it suggested that the monk was referring to Isa as Jesus. The idea that Jesus could have traveled to India seemed plausible, especially since Isa is the Arabic version of Yeshua, the Hebrew name from which we get Jesus. After this encounter, Notovitch visited Hemis Monastery, the largest Buddhist monastery in Ladakh, during a cultural festival. There he watched performances of music and dance, and afterward he was invited by the head lama for refreshments. Initially they discussed the performance, but soon Notovitch mentioned the prophet Isa. The Lama confirmed the story's truth and revealed that there were over 80,000 ancient scrolls stored in the monastery of Lhasa, the residence of the Dalai Lama in Tibet. These scrolls, according to the Lama, detailed the life of Isa, offering a potential explanation for the lost years of Jesus' life. A chapter left out of the Bible, but perhaps preserved in the sacred texts of another tradition. Could this be the missing piece that unlocks the mystery of Jesus' hidden years? These scrolls, written in Pali, the sacred language of Buddhism, included records of the lives of Buddhist saints, including Isa. They explained that it was common for student monks, when visiting Lhasa, to make translated copies of some sacred scrolls to take back to their own monasteries. The monk told Notovitch that the Hemis library had many of these copies, including several that detailed the life and deeds of the Buddha Isa. We promised to show these scrolls to Notovitch on a future visit to the monastery. For surprisingly, just a few days after leaving the monastery to continue his journey, Nicholas Notovitch had an accident. He fell from his horse and broke his leg. He returned to the Hemis monastery, where the monks allowed him to stay while he recovered. During this time, the head lama brought out 2 large time-worn bound volumes containing verses related to Isa. These verses were translated from Tibetan to Notovitch by his interpreter, revealing an extraordinary account of Jesus' life preserved in ancient Tibetan sacred scripture. The documents described how a divine boy named Isa was born in Israel to devout parents. From an early age, he displayed a profound understanding and wisdom far beyond his years. Upon turning 13, an age when many young Jewish boys were traditionally expected to marry, Isa was anticipated to take a wife. Wealthy and noble families began visiting his parents' home, hoping the exceptional boy would become their son-in-law. However, Isa had no desire to marry. Instead, he secretly left his parents' home during the night and joined a group of merchants embarking on a long journey to the east. They traveled along the trade route that connected Palestine to distant places like Persia, India, and even China. Isa accompanied this group of merchants until they reached Punjab, India, where they parted ways when he was just 14 years old. His reputation grew quickly as he traveled south through Punjab, spending time living among the devout Jainists. Just as in Palestine, the fame of this extraordinary young man spread rapidly. Isa was deeply respected and admired by everyone he encountered, though many asked him to stay with them. He chose to continue his journey eastward, eventually arriving in Jagannath, now known as Puri. There he was warmly welcomed by the Brahmin priests and stayed in Jagannath for 6 years. During this time, he devoted himself to studying the Hindu scriptures and traveled to the region's sacred cities, earning the affection of all. He met with the poor, teaching them and preaching that everyone was loved by God, while also criticizing the Brahmin priests for their idol worship and their disdain for the poorest members of Indian society. The hostility of the priests grew so intense that they sent servants of Medicine to capture and kill Isa. Aware of the danger, Isa fled during the night and began a long journey northward. Upon reaching Tibet, he found refuge with Buddhist monks, where he improved his knowledge of the sacred Pali language and devoted himself to studying and teaching the sacred texts. He spent another 6 years there before leaving the Himalayas and starting his long journey back west to his homeland, Palestine. As he traveled through Rajputana, Isa continued to preach about the importance of doing good to others and rejecting idol worship. The local inhabitants embraced Isa and his teachings, which led to another confrontation with the priests. Influenced by his teachings, the people began to destroy their idols, causing an uproar among the priests, who fled to avoid reprisals. Isa's fame spread and reached neighboring countries. When he arrived in Persia, the Persian priestry in Fars became alarmed and forbade the people from listening to him. However, the villagers warmly welcomed him and listened to his sermons with devotion. Eventually, the priests ordered that Isa be arrested and brought before the high priest for questioning. The high priest accused him of blasphemy and of sowing doubt among the faithful. But Isa rebuked him, saying that he should not worship the sun, which is merely a part of God's creation. Instead, he should revere only the true God, the creator of the sun and everything in the universe. So warned the priests that by instructing their followers to worship the sun, which moves only according to God's will. They were leading the children of God astray. After hearing Isa, the priests decided not to punish him directly. Instead, they expelled him beyond the city walls, leaving him at the mercy of. However, he suffered no harm and continued his journey back to Palestine, arriving there at the age of 29. The following part of the story was written approximately 3 to 4 years after Isa's death, based on accounts from merchants who had passed through Palestine after being in India. It tells how he spread his teachings to the Palestinian people, gaining thousands of followers until the authorities, concerned about his growing influence, decided to intervene. The text describes Isa's arrest, trial, and crucifixion in a manner similar to what the Gospels narrate about Jesus. However, there is a crucial distinction. While the Bible indicates that it was the Jewish priests who insisted on his crucifixion, these manuscripts claim that it was Pontius Pilate who demanded the execution, with the priests trying to argue for his release. There were other discrepancies with the biblical narrative, which is not surprising when considering the Buddhist version of these events. After all, the story of Isa's death reached India through accounts of merchants who had traveled from Palestine, where they heard tales about the events heard. It's possible that the version of events these merchants heard and then passed on was shaped by their own perceptions, especially since they were people of different beliefs and cultures. Despite these variations, it became clear to Notovitch that the prophet Isa mentioned in the Buddhist text was, in fact, Jesus Christ. Through these documents, he made an incredible discovery about what happened to Jesus during the periods not reported in the Gospels. After concluding his expedition, Notovitch wrote a detailed report about his adventures and the remarkable discovery he had made. He shared this report with a cardinal in Rome, who tried to persuade him to abandon the idea of publishing the book, even offering him money to desist. Notovitch refused the offer, and eventually, his book, The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, was released in France in 1894. As expected, the publication caused a great deal of controversy. Some accused Notovitch of fabricating the story of Isa. Others questioned the authenticity of the Buddhist text related to Joel's life. Some even doubted that Notovitch had actually traveled to Ladakh, or questioned the existence of the Himalayas monastery in the city of Leh. One of the most severe criticisms came from an article titled The Alleged Sojourn of Christ in India, written by Max Miller, a prominent professor at the University of Oxford and an expert in Eastern sacred texts. Miller quickly suspected that Notovitch's book was a fraud, a suspicion that was reinforced when British officials conducted investigations in Ladakh at his request. These officials reported that no Russian named Notovitch had passed through Leh, and that there were no records of any travelers staying at the Himalayas monastery to recover from a broken leg. In 1896, Notovitch's credibility suffered another blow when James Archibald Douglas, an English professor at the government college in Agradri, visited the Himalayas monastery to verify Notovitch's claims. Douglas reported that the leader of the monastery denied the existence of any manuscript mentioning the name of Isa, either at Himalayas or any other Buddhist site. He also stated that during his 15 years as the head lama at Himalayas, which included the period of Notovitch's supposed visit, no one had been permitted to translate manuscripts from the monastery. Despite Notovitch's efforts to maintain his reputation, the credibility of his book was severely damaged. However, many years later, evidence began to emerge that supported his claims, as other travelers visited the Himalayas monastery. In 1922, Swami Abhedananda, a disciple of the renowned Indian saint Ramakrishna, left the United States, where he had spent several years teaching, and set out to cross the Himalayas on foot, from Tibet to Kashmir. He made a stop at the Himalayas monastery, where the monks confirmed the key details about Notovitch's stay there for recovery. Like Notovitch, Abhedananda accessed a Tibetan manuscript that described the life of Isa, from which he transcribed several passages and later published in a Bengali book titled Journey to Kashmir and Tibet. The evidence supporting Notovitch's accounts continued to emerge. In the 1920s, Professor Nicholas Roerich, a Russian philosopher, writer, and artist known for his explorations in the Himalayas, encountered repeated references to the legend of Christ visiting India. He discovered trees and lakes where, according to local tales, Jesus had rested during his journeys, as well as a cave where he was said to have meditated. These legends were corroborated by the head of the monastery in Ladakh, where Roerich saw a manuscript that included many of the passages mentioned by Notovitch and Abhidhamma, along with other texts. One of these documents recounted how Jesus was welcomed in Tibet by a Buddhist sage named Minzi, and how he taught and healed the sick in Ladakh. In 1939, further confirmation of the manuscripts came when Gloria Gask, leader of the International Fellowship of Faith, traveled to Tibet with her friend Elizabeth Kaspari to study Buddhism. During their visit to the Hemis monastery, they were warmly welcomed. The monastery's chief librarian then presented 3 ancient parchment books, carefully protected between wooden plates and wrapped in green. With great reverence, he unrolled one of the books and showed it to the visitors, saying, "These books say and the Yus books say that your Jesus was here." He even allowed the 2 women, clearly astonished, to take photos of him holding these sacred texts. Thus, several pieces of evidence began to emerge, supporting the existence of Buddhist manuscripts that document Jesus' visit to Tibet, corroborating the narrative that Notovitch had introduced decades earlier. The document analyzes the life of easing doubts about the veracity of this narrative. According to the Gospels, there are no records of what Jesus did between the ages of 12 and 29. The Christian tradition, over 2,000 years old, believes that he remained in Palestine working as a carpenter. On the other hand, a Buddhist version suggests that he may have traveled to the east, which conflicts with this tradition. The hypothesis seems unlikely, but there are reasons to question it. Are there really Buddhist manuscripts that confirm Buddhist manuscripts that confirm this story? But even if such manuscripts exist, can we trust that the stories about Isa are true? And even if we accept them as true, can we be certain that Isa and Jesus are the same person? It's possible that the Buddhists may have conflated the stories of 2 different figures, the biblical Jesus and another holy man from Palestine who traveled through India. Additionally, there's the question of the journey itself. Would it really have been possible to undertake such an extensive and challenging journey at that time? And for a young devotee like Jesus, would he have really left his family and friends at the age of 13 to travel alone through unknown lands for 16 years? Let's explore these questions in detail. Nicholas Notovitch was shrewd in selecting witnesses to validate his story, choosing people who accompanied him to Hemis. Swami Abhidhamma, before going to the West to teach the Hindu Vedanta philosophy, lived and traveled as a monk throughout India, being widely respected as one of India's most prominent spiritual and cultural ambassadors. Professor Nicholas Roerich, on the other hand, was a renowned artist, writer, philosopher, and mystic, bringing even more credibility to the investigation. Nicholas Notovitch, who was nominated 3 times for the Nobel Peace Prize, gained recognition for promoting world peace by using art and culture as tools. Gloria Gask led the British section of the International Fellowship of Faith, an organization focused on uniting people with spiritual interests. On the other hand, Elizabeth Kaspari established several Montessori schools and training centers in the United States. Although we don't know many details about Nicholas Notovitch's personality and honesty, it is clear that the people who corroborated his story were highly respected and trustworthy. It seems unlikely that they would fabricate lies about having seen Buddhist manuscripts that recount the life of Isa. However, it is curious that visitors who went to the Hemis monastery after these events were granted access to the Isa manuscripts, while verification attempts by Miller and Douglas were categorically rejected. There are reasons why the monks might have given such different responses. The travels through India by Swami Abhidhamma, Nicholas Roerich, Elizabeth Kaspari, and Gloria Gask were motivated by a spiritual quest. This is entirely different from the visits to Hemis by Professor Douglas and other English officials who were there solely to interrogate the monks about the veracity of Notovitch's claims. That direct way of questioning wouldn't be well received by Buddhist monks, who usually assess the intentions of those asking questions before sharing sacred teachings. Additionally, the fact that the inquirers were English officials likely increased the monks' distrust, as many Indian treasures, including jewels, artworks, and cultural artifacts, were taken during the period of British rule. The manuscripts shown to Notovitch would certainly attract the interest of the British, and it's not surprising that the monks firmly denied their existence. Therefore, we can assume that the manuscripts do indeed exist, but the question remains, is their content true? The Buddhist authors of these texts could have based them on ancient myths or unverified local traditions, or they might have even created the entire story. However, this seems unlikely, as the documents preserved in Himalayas were Tibetan translations of ancient scrolls kept in the main Buddhist monastery in Lhasa, originally written in Pali, the sacred language of Buddhism. It's hard to believe that Buddhist monks would document the life of such a revered Buddhist saint in their sacred language if there were doubts about the truth of the facts. Therefore, it is reasonable to conclude that the monks believed in the authenticity of Isa's story. Isa and Jesus are considered the same person by some theories that explore ancient texts. The actions and teachings of Isa, as reported in the manuscripts, align with what we know about Jesus in the Bible. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus emphasizes love for God and neighbor as the greatest commandments. Similarly, Isa is described as advocating these principles and confronting religious leaders who violated them. For example, in Jagannath, Isa confronted a Brahmin priest for idolatrous practices and the unjust treatment of the poor, an attitude that echoes Jesus' criticism of Jewish religious leaders for hypocrisy. These parallels between Isa and Jesus suggest that they both share the same spiritual values and courage in challenging corrupt religious authorities, leading some to believe they might be the same person. As for the possibility that Jesus traveled to distant lands like India and Tibet, it's intriguing to consider. The existence of trade routes like the Silk Road, used since the time of King Solomon, makes it technically possible that he could have traveled that far. This hypothesis suggests that Jesus, while still young, might have ventured beyond the borders of his homeland, accompanying merchant caravans in search of knowledge and spiritual experience in other cultures. While this idea is fascinating, it remains speculative and is not widely accepted in mainstream historical or theological traditions. In modern times, it's rare to imagine a child behaving with such maturity, but Jesus was not an ordinary child and lived in a very different era. According to the Gospel of Luke, at just 12 years old, Jesus was already leaving scholars in awe at the temple, demonstrating his ability to think independently and engage in spiritual discussions for days without needing his parents' presence. This shows that from a young age, Jesus had a special awareness of his role and the right moments for each action according to the divine plan. Additionally, the Gospel of Matthew tells us that Jesus spoke to people about John the Baptist as the messenger who would prepare his way. In the Gospel of John, in the episode of the wedding at Cana in Galilee, Jesus, even before beginning his ministry, and while still very young, showed an awareness of his time and mission. When Mary informed him that the wine had run out, he initially hesitated, saying, "Woman, what does that have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." But eventually he fulfilled his mother's request, turning water into wine. This indicates that even at 13 years old, Jesus already understood the importance of following the divine plan at the right moment, waiting for John the Baptist's preparation before beginning his own ministry. The Bible and additional accounts of his life suggest that even at this age, Jesus possessed exceptional maturity and spiritual understanding, gaining admiration wherever he went. Jesus' popularity had grown so much that prestigious families sought out his parents to propose marriages, potentially expanding his fame among those awaiting the arrival of the Messiah. By traveling to distant lands, Jesus managed to distance himself from public attention in Palestine until the right moment, while also exploring and absorbing teachings from various spiritual cultures. This journey contributed to his growth in wisdom and grace before God and men. The Buddhist narratives about the life of Isa present a version of the years when Jesus supposedly traveled through the East, filling what would be a gap in the biblical records about his life. However, a significant question arises. If these stories are true, why aren't they shared with Christians? Traditionally, Catholic children are taught that their faith is the only true one, and that Eastern religions are pagan. It would be very difficult for the Church to maintain this position if it taught that Jesus spent a significant part of his life interacting with priests and followers of other beliefs. Clearly, if the Vatican were truly aware of these journeys to the East, it would likely have little interest in making such information public. Recently, we've seen a shift in the Church's hierarchy. In 2018, for example, the Pope organized a conference that included the participation of leaders from Buddhist, Hindu, Sikh, and Jain religions. During the event, he encouraged closer relations between Buddhists and Catholics to promote mutual understanding and respect for their respective spiritual traditions, aiming to offer the world an example of two values such as justice, peace, and respect for human dignity. And if you found this video intriguing and want to explore more mysteries like this, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts or any additional insights in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think. And of course, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. God bless.